Alrighty, okay, so this is going to be our very last lecture. I will say, very tragic week. 2 weeks ago we read, what's it called? Lenin's last work. Then, I think 2 weeks before that we read Luxemburg's last work. Today we're reading our last week of Trotsky because, once again, another death of a second international radical. So boo-hoo, lots of tears. I'll also say with this week, it's somewhat kind of fitting because we were supposed to do this week last week, so I might be a little bit hazy on the readings. But in some sense, that kind of speaks to Trotskyism itself, because Trotskyism itself was a tendency trying to hold on to the memory of 1917 during its disintegration. Let's talk about that. So to begin, we're going to just do a little historical timeline of what's going on during this time. What is the context of these texts, and whatever. And I'll also note here, this week, rather than most prior weeks where we heavily talk about the text, this week I'm actually going to talk more about, in some sense, what Trotskyism is responding to, or what Trotskyism is responding to, rather than really honing in on the main text for this week, which was the transitional program, also known as the death agony of capitalism. To begin with a little bit of a historical timeline. Last week we covered the period between 1923 to 1933. To talk a little bit about, talk a little bit about that timeline. That period from 1923 to 1933 was essentially taught from the moment of Lenin's death to Trotsky's power struggle with Stalin to finally being ousted out of the Soviet Union. During that period, you basically have two big moments in that period. You have the period from 1923 to 1928, where Trotsky is inside the Soviet Union, trying to reform the Communist Party, or trying to reform the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. He's trying to reform Russia. He is the left opposition, or he forms the left opposition within Russia. He's the left opposition. He is a faction within the Soviet Union. He's trying to reform reform the Communist Party from within, reform the Communist Party, the Soviet Union, and the Communist International from within. From 1928 to 1933, Trotsky is ousted out of Russia, but he still sees himself as part of the Communist International, where during this time he's still trying to reform the Communist International, or he's still trying to reform the Communist International. Still from within the Communist International, but from outside of the Soviet Union and the Communist Party there. In 1933, Hitler comes to power, and this is where Trotsky radically changes his approach. Where Trotsky goes from an approach of reform but not revolution to revolution. That actually, no, we need to take a more revolutionary stance. That actually, no, the Third International, the Comintern, has become just as bankrupt as the Second International. It has become a tool of, it has just become a tool of reformism. So this is where Trotsky changed his stance. So from 1933 to 1938, Trotsky basically builds up the Fourth International. This is basically where you have the origins of Trotskyism. It's in response to Hitler coming to power, which makes Trotsky have this realization that no, there needs to be we need to create a new international altogether in order to create revolutionary opportunities during this time. And then the last 2 years of Trotsky's life, 1938 to 1940, is basically, in some sense, I'll phrase it as Trotsky versus Trotskyism. And this is basically during the time when Hitler and Stalin make a pact together, which disillusions many of Trotsky's followers because of Trotsky's avid support for the Soviet Union, where a lot of Trotskyists themselves become very much disillusioned with this kind of support of the Soviet Union, despite in some sense Stalin's own collaboration with Hitler, right? So this is basically the last struggle Trotsky has in 1939 to 1940 of trying to defend the worker state during this time. During this kind of forward periodization, you could also kind of, in some sense, talk about the memory of 1917, where from 1923 to 28, Trotsky is holding up the year 1917 as kind of like, hey, this is what the Soviet Union is all about. You know, why is he trying to reform the Soviet Union? Why is he trying to reform the Communist International? It's to hold up the idea of 1917, right, in kind of its most clearest form, or like at the start of its regression. From 1928 to 1933, still on this idea of reform, but now outside of the communist. Now outside of the Soviet Union, he's still holding up the Soviet Union as still this memory of 1917, or still holding on to this memory of 1917. From 1933 to 1938, he's like, okay, the Soviet Union still is an expression of 1917, but the only way to recover that legacy is through through another revolution within the Soviet Union against this bureaucratic caste that has that has been made in it, and by revolutionizing the Communist International as a whole. And then from 1938 to 1940, in some sense, 1917 just becomes a symbol, or just in some sense, the Soviet Union no longer kind of only bears a resemblance to the year 1917, only in words. And in some sense, it's just Trotsky still holds on to that memory of 1917 in the face of historical regression. So now let's narrow into kind of this period between 1933 to 1940. So just covering the events that go on during this time. In 1933, you have Adolf Hitler come to power through the Nazis in Germany. He's elected, right? Here's where Trotsky has a realization that all of his critiques of the Soviet Union, or all of his critiques of the Soviet Union from within, or all of his critiques of the Communist Party from within, of the Comintern from within, has proved to be fruitless. Where he says that because he's noted that, or in 1933 he has a recognition that all of Stalin's policies basically paved the way for Hitler's victory. All of everything that Trotsky said about trying to support the revolution in Germany, all that sort of stuff, and trying to prevent Hitler's from coming to power, all of that was ignored. By 1933, Trotsky just has a critical recognition that we need to. He forms the I believe it's called the ICL, which is the International Communist League, which is basically this tendency which says, Hitler has come to power. We need to create an international communist tendency that opposes fascism and also opposes Stalinism that has become of the Communist International. We need to have this more revolutionary stance. So Trotskyism really begins with 1933. In 1935, you have, in some sense, you have the Comintern's response to the Comintern's response to fascism, the Popular Front, which is a gross caricature of Lenin and Trotsky's formulation of the United Front back in 1921, where back in 1921, Lenin and Trotsky formed the idea of creating a united front in which social democratic and communist workers would work, or in some sense, march separately but strike together against the bourgeoisie. And the whole idea there was to, in some sense, inspire a revolutionary leadership, or to kind of show the correctness of communist ideas through having these workers work together. It was a question of leadership. The Popular Front strategy, in some sense, is how it's a gross caricature of the United Front strategy is where the idea there is the Stalinists they make a very, weirdly enough, ultra-left turn where they say, we are not going to work with the Social Democrats. In fact, the Social Democrats they call social fascists. So on the one hand, they take a very sectarian stance against the Social Democrats. They're like, we're not going to work with the Trotskyists, we're not going to work with the Social Democrats. We're not going to work with the anarchists. They're all social fascists, right? But on the other hand, so on the one hand, it's an ultra-left policy. On the other hand, they say, how are we going to fight fascism? We're going to ally ourselves with the bourgeoisie in fighting fascism. So the idea there is we're going to we're going to protect liberal democracy against against the fascists, right? super gross caricature of the United Front, because the whole idea of the United Front was, hey, how do you prove the legitimacy of communism, or how do you, in some sense, get communist ideas across? You work with social democrats, you work with maybe reactionary workers, you involve yourself in the workers' movement to create a moment of revolutionary leadership, right? The Trotskyists at the time, they respond to the Popular Front with the United Front, which is the idea of actually we are going to work with the Stalinists, with the anarchists, with the social democrats, all in the opposition of fascism and bourgeois nationalism. Because the idea there is, okay, this is how you create a movement in which you prove the correctness of this is how you instill a revolutionary view against this kind of reformism within the Comintern as a secondary national. The strategy that's actually taken up is, over the world, is the Popular Front, and this in some sense leads to the failure of both France and Spain. Where in France you have this guy named Leopold Bloom, who's a secondary national social democrat, who I might be getting the details wrong with him, but I believe he's a social democrat where the Popular Front strategy essentially just fails in France, and that basically just leads to the victory of the fascists, because the social democrats are isolated from the Stalinists, and there's not an actual left opposition against the fascists, or there's not actually a left there to oppose the fascists, from occupying France. In Spain, this takes the form of the Spanish Civil War, where actually what you see is, well, first you see this guy named, I believe, Franco. I can't remember his full name. Franco come to power. Right over the skulls of many social democratic and communist workers, and then you actually do see the United Front strategy somewhat take effect there, where Trotskyists, anarchists, social democrats, Stalinists, they do all ally themselves, try to overcome Franco. I believe this actually leads to the victory of you actually do have an anarchist victory or whatnot, where for a while the anarchists actually are victorious in Spain, but it disintegrates almost immediately, where the anarchists are like, oh, well, we have emergency measures, actually, and then they just capitulate to the bourgeoisie, which, I mean, if we remember last week, Trotsky's whole criticism of them was, oh, look, the anarchists had the recognition that they needed to use the state, but because they didn't have a recognition of the state beforehand, they just capitulated to, bourgeois nationalism. The Popular Front takes place in 1935. The Popular Front takes place in 1935. In 1936, you see the consequences with in Spain and France. In 1937, you have, within the Soviet Union, the Great Purge, where within the Soviet Union, you have Stalin essentially, mass murder and persecute much of the old Bolsheviks. Included in this is Bukharin, Zionov, Kamenev, many of the Bolsheviks who took part in the October Revolution back in 1917, and it's super horrifying across the world, because along with just murdering most of the old Bolsheviks, you also have this weird thing where it's they would come to the Moscow trials, or they would come to their trials, and they would essentially just confess to their Trotskyism, where they basically Stalin would make them force them to say that they were a Trotskyist fascist wrecker and all this sort of stuff in order to delegitimize these Bolsheviks, and then later persecute them. So here's where basically many of the oppositional forces to Stalin during the time are just immediately eradicated, right? Trotsky as kind of outside the Soviet Union remains kind of a communist dissident outside the Soviet Union that still is Trotskyism remains kind of, in some sense, the only world historical tendency that is, in one sense, a dissident of communism, but still holds on to the memory of Leninism in 1917 against kind of Stalin, or against the Stalinism that you see in the Soviet Union. So the Great Purge, many old Bolsheviks are persecuted and killed, and if I remember correctly, this is also kind of in response to the failure of the 5-year plan, where millions of peasants die, and then it's just the bureaucracy has to find a way to blame this failure on the bureaucracy has to find a way to blame this failure on someone, as to not make the blame fall on itself. So it blames the Trotskyist fascist records, which is just any sort of dissidence within the Soviet Union. So that just falls onto like the right opposition with Bukharin, with Zionov, Kamenev, with many of these old Bolsheviks. So yeah, that happens with. So that's the Great Purge right there. In 1938, the Fourth International is officially founded. So the Fourth International is officially founded with many different dissident tendencies within communism coming together under the banner of the Fourth International, against the Stalinization of the Soviet Union, but also in critical support, against Stalinism, but with critical support of the Soviet Union. The Fourth International understands itself as continuing the legacy of Bolshevik Leninism, right, or Bolshevist Leninism. In 1939, you have the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, which is essentially a double horror here, which is basically you have Hitler and Stalin creating a pact in one sense to split Poland, and also just in some sense there's just a kind of a peace treaty there. So in some sense it's like, even though it's inaccurate to call Nazism National Socialism, because was Nazism National Socialism? No, but in some sense this actually kind of proves is it accurate to call Stalinism red fascism? Maybe. In a sense that, did Stalinism, did the Soviet Union have elements of socialism in it? Yes, it was the product of 1917. It was a product of a workers' revolution. It was a product of, the workers actually, seizing state control. But also, you have the degradation of the Soviet Union to, basically, a red fascism, where it's just like, oh, the worker state itself becomes, what Trotsky calls a fascism, the petty bourgeois run amok, in 1939 you have Hitler and Stalin make a pact. This kind of creates a tension within Trotskyism itself, where a lot of Trotsky's followers become very disillusioned with the Fourth International, with Trotsky. So Trotsky starts to essentially have many disputes with his followers regarding regarding the Soviet Union. And then in 1940, Trotsky is tragically assassinated in his own home by a Stalinist agent named Mercer, who was posing as his gardener. Where he has an ice axe and he fucking picks Trotsky on the head. So that's the historical context. In the next lesson we'll get into more of the content of this week.